In this video we're going to take a look at images shot from a drone. But the logic and the techniques are really no different than with ground-based cameras. But there are one or two issues I think are worth mentioning. These two sets of images were shot with automatic exposure bracketing set on the drone's camera. But when we view both sets of images, we see that almost any of the three shots we've taken would give us an acceptable result. So I suppose the obvious question here is, was the automatic exposure bracketing entirely necessary here? No is the obvious answer to that previous question. But that's due to the subject. It doesn't have any bright highlights or dark shadows. It's the nature of the light. It's the time of day. And the fact that with the drone looking down, the sun's behind us. Now that's always been the easiest exposure to predict and get right. But of course we're not always going to be aware of this, are we? Now I shoot practically all my still images on the drone using RAW format and with automatic exposure bracketing set. Generally 3 shots, 1 stop apart. So I've got 1 shot where the camera feels the exposure is correct, 1 shot where I've increased the exposure 1 stop or doubled the exposure, and another shot where I've halved the exposure 1 stop under. Now I do that for the following reasons. Once the drone is airborne, your battery power is rapidly being drained, and like any aircraft, we're going to want to leave some battery power as a margin for error to get back safely. Now I'm not suggesting here that the drone is generally miles away, far from it, but time seems to go a lot faster when we're in full creative mode and we're having a bit of fun with our photography. So my guess will be that I have about 15 minutes before I start glancing at that battery readout on the screen. Now, as we know from our ground-based cameras, trying to evaluate critical exposure on a small screen, sometimes in bright conditions, is not always easy. So automatic exposure bracketing allows me to concentrate more on my photography and not worry about exposure too much or the drone dropping into the lagoon here through lack of battery power. It also allows us to press the shutter button and capture those 3 shots quickly and automatically. It speeds up the shooting because we have the confidence that at least one of all 3 of these exposures is going to be good. So we're not constantly adjusting exposures on the mobile phone display while the drone is in flight and while we're using up battery power. Now once we have the 3 shots taken, what's the worst that can happen? We may delete 2 of them, but that's easy to do when we're sitting comfortably in front of our computer. Those same 3 shots may produce a good HDR image, or we could use 2 of the images for exposure blending. You know, the good sky from one image with the good foreground from another. So there's 3 good reasons for automatic exposure bracketing when shooting from a drone. We capture the best exposure we can, we make best use of the drone's time in the air, and we have flexibility when it comes to editing. The Mavic Pro 2 drone that I use captures 20 megapixel images, but I've noticed that the images are not quite up to the same standard as the 20 megapixel images I get from my Canon SLR, but I don't think that's going to be a great surprise. It's not just the pixel count that creates top image quality. The Mavic images are still very good, but I do notice a slightly less dynamic range and just a little more noise in the images than my Canon SLR. The image processing takes just a little more of my attention to really bring out the best in Adobe Camera Raw, or if you're a Lightroom user, in Lightroom. And this really brings us back full circle and to the importance of exposure and the message of this video. All images will benefit when we're moving those image editing sliders from lighter tones towards darker ones, not the other way around. It's a lot easier to adjust for exposure, contrast, colour and clarity, and we have a little more latitude with those raw sliders. I find that I can lean on them just a bit heavier when I need to. So when we edit from raw images that are on the brighter side of the exposure but not overexposed, noise will always be kept to a minimum, and we're less likely to make that significantly worse through the manipulation process. Now what I've described here is not a great mystery, and we all know it as exposing to the right. It's a great technique for raw images, but a little more crucial when you're using a camera that's airborne and in a place you may not be able to get to very easily again. Now, to prove my point, take a look at this thumbnail where I really could have done with a set of bracketed images here, because a bit more light in the sensor would have been quite a positive thing. So why didn't I practice what I've been preaching here, I can hear you asking? Well, simply that I was taking quite a bit of video this particular evening with the drone on the move, and taking a couple of stills just as I was about to pack up was really an afterthought. But it certainly was a mistake not to bracket the exposures here. But it does leave me with an image to test our processing skills. Now, I don't think there's much doubt that we will get a reasonable result from this image in Adobe Camera Raw, but it is likely to need some noise suppression, and that's going to have a bit of a penalty. I'm going to make a start here in the Basic tab and with the exposure. If you look at the histogram up at the top right, as I increase the exposure, you can see the histogram starts to look a little bit better. Nicely spread, and the peaks are coming up quite high. I think I can come back maybe a little bit. A tiny bit of highlights to push it more to the right, little touch of whites to try to make as much of the contrast as I can. Maybe a little bit down on the shadows, a little bit down on the blacks. A bit of clarity maybe. A fair amount of vibrance, but the problem here is quite obvious, I think. But I'm going to push quite a bit of vibrance in here. But then maybe if I go to my color mixer and I've got the saturation tab checked, I'm going to pick up my targeted adjustment. And in the water on the right, I'm going to click and drag to the left just to lessen that a bit. And it's having a similar effect in the sky. So I've just tempered that color there a little bit. I'll jump back to the Basic tab just for a moment. Maybe I'll reassess my exposure, just drop that down a tiny amount. I'm going to pick up my graduated filter here, and I'll click and drag across the horizon. Touch the V key to hide that so I can drop the exposure in the sky a little bit. Maybe a little bit of extra clarity there, and maybe even a bit of colour. Let's take a look. No, it's just pushing back what I took away a few moments ago. I'm going to touch the V key again because I may just put another graduated filter just up at the top left. I'll hit the V key and double click the exposure, because all I want to do is to add just a little bit there, just to give it a bit of balance. And I think I'll finish off here with a radial filter. I'll click, hit the V key and just drop down the exposure. Now we're all going to choose something different here, but I'm going to touch the Z key to bring my zoom tool back. Then let's click and drag and look at the damage. And we can see it quite clearly. Let's have a bit of the sea and a bit of the sky. got a little bit of a, looks like a rock sitting there. That's easy to put right, of course, with the healing brush. Let me just give that a click, and that looks pretty good. Okay, so what we've got to do here now is we've got to do some damage limitation, because we're going to need the detail tab, and we need to look at the noise reduction. Now I've already opened up this down here, so I'll close that up for a minute. Normally when we open up the detail, I go straight to the noise reduction. We can see exactly what we're doing here. My image is about 131% enlarged. So if I push the noise reduction up to about 30, you can see it makes quite a difference. If I double click and reset it, you can see it's having an effect, but we need to do a little more here than just that one slider. So I think I need to go to my color noise reduction and drop down the options there. I'm going to go to the top slider. I'm going to move it across to the right quite a bit, and if we keep our eye on the sky there, when I do that, you can see it does make a significant difference. So the trick with this slider is not to go too far, to go as far as we think we need to go. So if I double click and reset it, there we can see what we're beginning with. So if I bring it to the center, yes, I'm getting some response, but I think I can go a little further. Now what I try to aim for here is the maximum effect, but without softening the image more than I need to, but I think that's inevitable here. If we look at the detail and I move that across to the right too, you can see the detail actually increases. So if I go the other way, well, let me reset it first so we've got a basis to judge. If I go about halfway down from the center point to the left, is that making a difference? It's not a great deal. I need to take it down a bit further perhaps. There's not a great deal of difference there. So I may as well leave it in the center. Maybe there's a little tiny difference, but it may be difficult for you to see that on a recorded video. But I could use the smoothness here. I'll go to the right, and that does smooth things out quite a bit. So once again, double click to reset it. Let's take it halfway and see the effect. I think you get the idea with these sliders is to take them as far as you can, but without softening the image too much. We never get rid of all of the noise, of course. There's always going to be a little bit there. But I think I've probably got as much as I'm going to get redeemed from this image. So I can right click and fit the image in view. And once we've done that, then we could reassess any of the changes we made in the basic tab. But if not, and we're happy to open this picture up into Photoshop, well then that's as far as we're going to go. Now once the image is opened up into Photoshop, the image doesn't look too bad. Yes, there's a degree of softness there, but given the subject matter, I don't think it's overly damaging. But the image certainly would have been a lot less noisy had we been able to start the manipulation with maybe a stop or even 2 stops more exposure squeezed into the sensor. Now you'll notice up at the top right there's 2 layers. What I've done to give ourselves a comparison here, the top one we're looking at the moment includes the noise suppression that I took a fair amount of time with. But I've created another layer here that doesn't have any noise suppression at all. So looking at the image filling the screen, I can turn off the layer that contains the noise suppression, and we get to see a before and after. If you look at the horizon around the center of the screen, around this area here, you'll notice there's a difference there even at this size. It's softened to the degree that we're beginning to lose those clouds along the horizon, and we could argue that it's not significant. Looking down at the water in the bottom right, just above the rocks here, we can see a difference there. But let's go to the zoom tool and we'll zoom in, let's go to 200%, and I'll look at an area we was looking at before. We'll take a look at a bit of sky and a bit of the water. We're looking at the noise suppression layer at the moment. Let's remove it. And there is quite a difference. Let's go to the left because I think we could see a lot more here. You see, this is a darker part, and it's an area where I've vignetted it as well. So I've probably been a bit heavier on the sliders. So this side is certainly bearing the brunt of the fact that we began the manipulation with an image which really was a little bit underexposed. But we are able to redeem things, but there is a cost. But with a landscape like this, I don't think the cost is that high, but of course it's much better if we can actually manipulate our images with the best exposure we can begin with and limit the noise in the first place. Although here the main subject is dealing with drone photography, what we've described here and the solutions to avoid noise is much the same across all aspects of our photography. I'll see you next time.